Hey, Julian.
Hey, Spac.
How's it going?
Pretty good, pretty good. Yourself?
All right. We've just spent a little bit of time away from DC, as is probably appropriate, given that nothing good has happened here over the last several weeks. I've been in Richmond for about a week. I understand you've been traveling also.
I just got back from visiting some friends in Philadelphia.
That's good to hear.
But I'm sure the government already knows, and now even our Skype conversation can now be listened to with increasing ease.
Yeah, if there was one good thing that happened over the last couple days, ironically, it was the worldwide collapse of Skype due to an unspecified software problem. And so for a few short hours, I think maybe only about 36 or so, whatever intercepts the NSA may have collected were obstructed from at least that avenue of communication. So hopefully whatever privacy interests we still have enshrined in law were somehow upheld then, as we just simply found more off the charts methods of communication.
Yeah, no, even the NSA still has trouble intercepting those carrier pigeons.
Yeah, I have myself. It's a shame you recently moved just a couple blocks away, but for those not in the know here, Julie and I used to live around the corner from one another, and we communicated by just sending dogs with messages from his backyard to mine. But we've been both writing about this over the last couple weeks. As everyone knows, and as Aaron Kerr and Marty Letterman recently told everyone on Blogging Heads, we've had one of the most profound shakeups in the last 30 years or so in communications law, in national security law, and in the field of everyone's privacy interests, with the wholesale carve-out that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act underwent at the end of the congressional session. I've been interested to see a lot of what you've been writing about this, Julian, as it turns out we have rather similar takes on it. I'm curious to know what you think are the most problematic aspects of the Protect America Act, as we've now called it.
Well, one of the interesting things is that just this morning, Jim Fison and Eric Lichtblau, who originally broke the NSA warrantless wiretap story a couple of years back, had a piece today suggesting that even the incredible expansion of surveillance power that was initially interpreted as being the effect of the Protect America Act may have been sort of understated. That in fact, the change in the definition of electronic surveillance to exempt intercepts directed at persons abroad may include the power to essentially to look at entirely domestic records, business records, for example, or to conduct domestic surveillance simply as part of an investigation directed at a foreign person. And normally, I would say that even that, that was too paranoid. But the response from the administration officials quoted in this article is not exactly heartening. You would expect that what they would say is, no, of course, they've given us an insane amount of power here, but that's just not what this law says, and yet that is not the tenor of the response.
I recall the response was something like, that wasn't the intent of the law when we were drafting it.
Yeah, they said we shouldn't worry that because the intent of this law is pure. I mean, the administration has for years been playing sort of Goldberg variations with trust us as the aria, and it looks like this is another instance of that. I have no idea at this point why anyone thinks trusting in the pure intent of anything connected to this administration is terribly compelling. But it should be said that even absent that, this is incredibly troubling on a number of levels. I mean, one is just that despite the fact that a lot of the conservative press seems to have been hewing to the frankly ludicrous line that this does nothing but close the intelligence gap by enabling the NSA and other intelligence organizations to intercept as traditionally they've been able to foreign communications without judicial oversight. And indeed, even more ridiculous, this is somehow returning FISA to its original intent, which is interesting because FISA was passed initially in response to the findings of the Church Committee in the late 70s that various intelligence organizations had been carrying out a series of illegal domestic-to-foreign communications intercepts through programs like Project Shamrock and NS Lingual. And so, in fact, FISA was precisely intended to provide judicial oversight over the kinds of surveillance that this new amendment now permits without any kind of judicial oversight, except an after-the-fact survey of the general guidelines used to attempt to minimize the extent to which American communications, or the communications of American persons are picked up in the course of investigations directed at foreign persons.
One thing there, in the language of the bill, it doesn't specify foreign persons. What it specifies is that the surveillance must be reasonably believed to be targeted at intercepts of people believed to have foreign intelligence information. In short, the law isn't so much about what sorts of persons can be surveilled upon, but rather the substance of that communication in the interpretation given by a reasonable, NSA line analyst.
Yeah.
So
part of the problem is, of course, how vague the language of the law is. I mean, this is an administration that has not just sort of give an inch, take a mile, but give an inch, they'll take a mile, and 6 months later they'll claim it was actually a parsec. This is the same administration that claimed that the initial NSA wiretap program had actually sort of voce been authorized by the authorization for the use of military force in Afghanistan, which came as some surprise to the legislators who had not apparently intended to authorize any such thing. And so the fact that so many people are having trouble figuring out exactly how much authority this grants should be troubling in itself, given that we've seen an extraordinarily willingness to drive as much power through every possible misplaced comma as a team of lawyers can squeeze.
To give a bit of a personal anecdote to the Rise and Lichtblau story, a couple days after the bill passed, I found myself trying to do a similar kind of takeout, and what I found through talking to people who had been read into the bill at one stage of the negotiation or the other was that there was a debate among experts now over whether the change to the definition of electronic surveillance that Risen and Lichtblau write about in today's paper actually meant. Whether, to get a bit technical, what the language does is it reinterprets electronic surveillance that's subject to a FISA court review, and it seems like on one reading of the bill that the only thing that's changed is the not persons who are liable to be intercepted, but methods of communication that are subject to it. And another school of thought says no, that's in fact exactly wrong. What it means is that if the government wanted, it could move into places where such surveillance or even just such information is stored. Such communications are stored, and actually just physically, take what it wanted, which raised questions about a certain section of FISA that gets you what's not electronic surveillance as other forms of surveillance, meaning personal home records, your home computer, things that are stored. And I found just through the course of the day getting increasingly just lost by the number of people who had such radically different interpretations of what that provision meant, and just even what changing electronic surveillance meant as either a semantic switch that allowed a broader category of surveillance that didn't require specificity from the FISA court, or just took away individualized suspicion or probable cause-based warrants, or whether it meant something far more invasive, far more expansive in terms of government authority. And you really get a sense there of why the intent of this law doesn't matter at all,
Right.
and that its application will be as widespread as almost assuredly many critics fear. One thing that the FISA court is not exactly famous for is turning down warrants from responsible filing parties. I think something like less than what was the statistic when the story first broke? It was something like less than 5% of warrants had ever been turned down. And previously, sorry,
I don't think it's even that high.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right about that.
Certainly not recently.
Well, what you get now is at least initially when for the last nearly 30 years, FISA had required a probable cause-based warrant that specified who the target of the surveillance was and the methods that were going to be employed to conduct the surveillance, what minimization procedures are in place. Now what you would file to the FISA court doesn't include anything of the sort. What you now are permitted to do is basically submit guidelines for how surveillance will occur that will supposedly minimize the likelihood of targeting purely domestic communications. And it raised the question of to what degree this sort of reduces FISA court judges to the role of I guess you might even call them mathematical experts. How good is their calculus abilities at discerning which logarithm for surveillance is indicative of an unreasonable search that would violate the Fourth Amendment, and what algorithm just properly permits foreign and domestic communications in the sort of cases that the law envisions to occur apace. And making matters worse, we're probably not ever going to know what any kind of guidelines for the minimization of what's collected will be. All of this occurs basically in camera, not to the FISA court even, but to the Senate and House Intelligence Committees. And all it says is basically that the Attorney General, along with the Director of National Intelligence, will submit reports every so often updating the committees about how they're not going beyond what guidelines they've established for collecting information in these sorts of surveillance activities. It doesn't say, and I think this is kind of crucial to the bill, that the Attorney General or the DNI ever have to submit to Congress what those guidelines are. They just basically will be putting the committees in position to hear reports about how they're not abusing secret guidelines.
Yeah. I want to say incidentally that I think your use of the term algorithm is both telling and apt. My pet theory here, which I think 5 years ago would have been paranoid, but is at this point probably well supported by at least circumstantial evidence, is that the reason they were so very anxious not to have the FISA court involved in any kind of prospective authorization, but rather only approving guidelines after the fact, is that guidelines are the kind of thing that can be embedded in algorithms, in electronic search algorithms. So if the only thing that's subject to approval is not specific searches or specific attempts to surveil particular targets, but rather the guidelines in place to minimize the exposure of Americans' communications, then that does seem to be much more compatible with what a lot of people believe has been going on, which is a kind of dragnet search during which very powerful computers are siphoning in vast streams of communications data and plucking out on the basis of either keyword identification or some sort of pattern matching calls or emails that should be flagged for later human analysis. And this is the kind of thing that even the FISA court would be unlikely to sort of prospectively license. But if you have a series of minimization guidelines that can be embedded in the algorithms that those computers are using, and the court is signing off on those, then in a sense, there's no point at which the court becomes cognizant of whether the kind of surveillance that's happening is traditional targeted surveillance or this extraordinary vacuum cleaner kind of surveillance where the minimization guidelines are sort of automatically and algorithmically applied as a way of selecting out communications from that vast haystack.
I don't really see a reading of the bill, or at least a plausible reading of the bill, whereby that wouldn't be the correct one. It's one of the main features, not a bug of the Protect America Act, that there is no individualized suspicion. There is no sense of the bill's focus in which it goes beyond intercepts, that it goes beyond intelligence collection methods and specifies that there are certain people who meet certain criteria beyond someone who is reasonably believed to possess foreign intelligence information and is reasonably believed to be outside the country, whatever that means. It's just a license for a pretty dramatically large dragnet, and everything that's been reported over the last couple of years about how data mining technology is increasingly in vogue in the Defense Department, in the intelligence services, and NSA has tried to sort of come up with different sort of software solutions to figure out how it can better make use of this technology without running afoul of the law. Seems of a piece with the reasons for putting this bill forward.
And I think it's worth saying, if I can maybe sound a slightly unlibertarian note for a moment, that I think there are interesting questions as to how we can, with due respect for domestic liberties, make use of technology like this, which in one sense has the potential to allow surveillance that is in a way more protective of people's liberties. Because you can imagine that you have a technology where the first order filtering, at least, or at least a great deal of the filtering, is done by computer. And you can imagine a case where in some sense it doesn't matter if the government listens to my phone conversation, if the only government agent that's listening is a hard drive somewhere that's running an algorithm against it. And so the interesting question is, well, can we find a way that this can be used so that actually pretty sweeping kinds of surveillance are done, but that the original intent of these legal protections is preserved, because the way that the information can be used is still limited by the fact that only part of the conversation is ever heard by a human, or that there's some sort of additional oversight, not in the initial acquisition stage, but at the stage where it goes from purely computer analysis to human analysis. And the problem is that there's no public discussion of what kind of novel structures we might want to put in place. Maybe not traditional warrants, but some kind of oversight body that would include mathematicians, technicians, judges, that would look at different stages of the information acquisition process, and perhaps have different sort of hoops that intelligence agencies could jump through, depending not just on when they wanted to acquire communications information, but what kind of analysis they wanted to run on it, what they wanted to do with it.
To look at the problem from a different but related perspective, one of the first pieces I ever wrote about this after Risen Lickblow broke the story was the question of to what degree one would consider X degrees of separation from a known al-Qaeda agent, which we should say the bill doesn't specify that anyone in the surveillance chain in fact needs to be. But initially, or
indeed that the intelligence sought is related to terrorism anyway.
At all. We're just talking about foreign intelligence information, or someone reasonably believed to be in possession of such. This goes far beyond terrorism, and one could easily see a definition of a legitimate target of surveillance under this bill that's simply a foreign diplomat, a foreign dignitary. There's no reason why I would think that I couldn't now, under this bill, basically surveil on, any member of the United Nations, in New York. I don't see any reason why. But
we've done a bit on the substance here. I was wondering, do you think maybe we should move on and just say something about the politics of this?
Let me just say one thing here from a national security perspective. A debate, raging among national security experts, and particularly counterterrorism people, is the question of to what degree someone who's X numbers of separation from a known al-Qaeda asset or a known al-Qaeda figure can be considered in any sense part of the surveillance chain. In any sense reasonably connected to al-Qaeda. and it has a lot to do with our evolving understandings of what the Al-Qaeda network or the Al-Qaeda movement is, to what degree we want to credit second or third generation offshoots from the original Al-Qaeda as part and parcel of the broader jihadist movement that takes Al-Qaeda's blend of Salafism as its calling card. And unless we address that, it seems a little bit premature to have a debate over to what degree such a dragnet is appropriate, because you won't really know what you're filtering down to. If eventually I'm talking to someone who's a complete cutout or has you can easily see this going in any number of different permutations, but eventually a journalist talking to someone who's talked to someone who's talked to someone who's talked to someone who eventually makes it back to some safe house in Karachi, to what degree is listening to that journalist's phone call take away the privacy aspect of it? A wise or valid use of national security resources which have opportunity costs associated with them.
I mean, in addition to the question of how many links down the chain, there's the question of what constitutes a link in a chain.
Right.
And if there's a Salafist website or blog, as a citizen sitting in D.C., I surf to it. I mean, my IP address connects to that site. Is that a link in the chain? Is that a communication of a sort? Obviously.
Well, one reading of the entire program is that the terror surveillance program is a program about metadata. In short, what IP address connects to what IP address, as opposed to the substance of the communication that goes through them. And if that happens, what the program may in fact be doing is just sifting out patterns and frequency of communication. Someone like the owner of the Site Institute, which is a prominent think tank that goes through jihadist websites and plucks out and in many cases translates jihadist communications, is going to these sites on a frequent basis as part of a very useful and informative business that has a lot of clients inside the government as well. I'm sure the Site Institute is now a target of this surveillance and has every reason to be.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, probably many of your conversations.
Yeah, dear God, I'm sure a lot of us have. If you've called a number in Baghdad, you have every reason to be surveilled under the bill, and we'll probably not ever be able during the life of the Protect America Act, and it's supposed to sunset or go out of business basically in 6 months. Find out what those guidelines, minimization procedures, and such really in fact are.
Well, that's actually not a bad segue, since we could actually go on for quite a while, I'm sure, about the substance of it, but that's not a bad segue to the politics of it. As you mentioned, this is supposed to be like a sort of summer in the Arctic. It sunsets in 6 months, but I have my doubts about whether that will happen, despite the Democratic leadership's professed eagerness to revisit this issue as soon as the autumn session begins. You've also done a lot of great reporting on the sort of blow-by-blow of how this was rammed through in the first instance. So maybe that's something you want to sort of run back over quickly. Sure.
A lot of this wasn't clear at the time, and it's still becoming. It still has a bit of a haze over it in retrospect, as different accounts can diverge wildly over this thing. But basically, in March, there was a FISA court ruling that somehow said we will no longer be able to obtain purely foreign-to-foreign communications that have been routed through communication switches in the United States. And this led, within a month, Mike McConnell, the Director of National Intelligence, to say that the Intelligence Committee in the Senate needed to help revise the FISA bill, as there was a lot of stuff that he wasn't collecting. Negotiations sort of proceed behind the scenes for the next several months. By May, McConnell starts to sound noises about his frustration with the fact that he doesn't believe that the NSA is able to collect as much intelligence as it needs to. And over this period of time, something else starts to happen, which is that intelligence chatter starts to pick up, as well as human intelligence in foreign countries, that this summer some kind of spectacular attack is supposed to take place. And this informs the debate over the FISA bill as well. There will be people, I think Russ Feingold has said that there was some overhyping of intelligence behind closed doors in the Senate Intelligence Committee in order to sort of scare Democrats into voting for the bill. But basically, the Democrats had said that they wouldn't go forward on the FISA bill until the Bush administration turned over documentation establishing the origins of the program, which began in October 2001, sort of constellation of surveillance programs that occurred without warrants for foreign and domestic communications. And eventually, I think in July, the Senate Judiciary Committee subpoenaed those records, and the administration has decided to defy the subpoena. All this meant that the bill that McConnell wanted increasingly stalled, and by the end of the month, negotiations were proceeding very furiously in order to make sure that the administration got a bill before the congressional session ended. On about the Thursday before the session ended, the Democrats put forward something that they believe met McConnell's sort of baseline desires for the bill, which is that, in particular, there would be a kind of, for lack of a better term, broad brush collection period for 45 days in which really anything went. You could surveil any sorts of targets, and then after that 45-day period, which would start out with a FISA court sort of, for lack of a better term, general warrant. Were there persons inside the U.S. Who fell into that dragnet that the administration, or the NSA in particular, probably FBI here also, would consider persons of interest, someone relevant to a terrorism investigation? The administration would have to go back to the FISA court and submit a probable cause-based warrant that specified who the target of the surveillance was and how the surveillance would proceed, and it would proceed for up to a year. McConnell, very late Thursday night, put out a statement that indicated that he was amenable to going to the FISA court. And Democrats in that negotiation, particularly in the House, were under the impression that McConnell had signed off on this proposal that was embodied in the Rockefeller offering that would get ultimately trashed the next day in the Senate. McConnell's people took a couple days to say this, including to me, that wasn't the case, that they never had a deal. But the Democrats walked away from the negotiation that night believing they had a deal on this, and the next morning, President Bush called McConnell, and then ultimately the deal, whatever version of the Rockefeller bill people thought was up for at least the final stages of negotiation, was scrapped. And Bush put out a statement that afternoon in the Rose Garden with McConnell next to him, saying that it was unacceptable that Congress couldn't come up with a bill. At that point, the basis of what we're talking about, which becomes S-1927, gets put forward in the Senate. The Senate ultimately passes it, and the House would take it up the next day after, at this point, the Democrats believed that it was better to go into the summer talking about Iraq and not having the prospect of having to, confront the question of, the intelligence community believes it's not getting intelligence on al-Qaeda. There's credible reason to believe that there may be some kind of spectacular attack planned for this summer. How could you adjourn without having something put in place? And as a result, we are where we are. Yeah.
Interesting to me, incidentally, was how amazingly opaque was the statement by McConnell, sort of rejecting as unacceptable the House compromise, the Democratic bill, and I was wondering, what you made of that. I just thought it was intriguing that he was saying this bill does not give me sufficient power to protect America, but was oddly canny about what exactly it was that he needed that was so very important.
Well, ultimately, he ends up saying, "I'll go back to the FISA court if you really, really make me." And the substance of what he would go back for was not specified. The Democrats thought that was a reference to Rockefeller's bill, that there would be a multi-tiered process in which the FISA court is in control of the entirety of the program. So at least before 11 o'clock on that Thursday, McConnell was still of the impression that there would be no way that the FISA court could bless the sort of surveillance that he was talking about, and then ultimately decided that there would be no way that the bill could move forward without FISA being the basis for any sort of surveillance. And at that point, the Democrats thought they had won, and ultimately what turns out is that in that sense, yes, FISA does remain, but there's this massive carve-out that's taken to FISA that arguably means that everything you know about FISA is now no longer operative.
I should say, I think from a sort of strictly strategic standpoint, this is, I think, a move we've seen them play a bunch of times. I mean, something that they've understood is that and it's like a good chess player knows that even if you're at a material disadvantage, or, in terms of the number of pieces you've got on the board, if you can control the tempo, it doesn't matter. And they've become incredibly good, it seems like, at controlling tempo. And this seems like a case in point, where this very broad and incredibly vague bill gets essentially passed in the last 24 to 48 hours before the end of the session. It seems like they've become incredibly adept at creating this sort of series of constant crises. I've said before, it's a perpetual September 12th, where it's always sort of right on the verge of catastrophe, right? Always necessary to do something right now without very thorough consideration.
One thing that I found, I've been unable to report out, but Russ Feingold hinted at sort of obliquely in one of the New York Times stories about how this bill came to be, and there wasn't much elaboration on it, so that makes me feel at least somewhat better as a reporter. Is that there was some kind of reference behind the scenes to the prospect of an attack happening very soon. Towards the end of the session, around like the 20th or so, I'm having a hard time remembering, there was a big hearing in the House. It was a joint hearing I was at of the Intelligence and the Armed Services Committees on the National Intelligence Estimate on threats to the homeland, as Orwellian a term as that is. The Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Jim Clapper, was there. He's one of McConnell's deputies. It's basically the head of Defense Intelligence, as well as a number of Homeland Security and Pentagon and officials from the National Intelligence Council, and they were emphasizing that they couldn't perceive something happening more or less immediately towards an attack in the United States, but they had what they kept on referring to as strategic warning. And many of the Republicans on the panel, on the joint panel, started talking about FISA in this context, bringing up the fact that they didn't have a bill yet that they were ready to pass, and what a danger that could present. And there it seemed like there was at least some kind of hint that behind the scenes in the committees, there was some kind of effort towards suggesting that strategic warning, as it's been portrayed in public, was some kind of tactical intelligence that specified something happening in a relatively short time frame, that unless the intelligence community, and in particular the NSA, was allowed to engage in a kind of surveillance dragnet, would leave the country incredibly exposed. And some of the rhetoric at the end of the negotiations from McConnell which seems to have poisoned some of his relations with Democrats on the intelligence committees, indicated that may in fact have been the case. That there was not just a sort of strategic warning about something happening, but something really specific that had people's hairs on fire. And, as much as the bill, presents, really problematic aspects to it, that's not something that's sort of easily, explained away or not something that's sort of, easily dismissed. What really does need to be, addressed, though, is in fact, how could a surveillance dragnet of such size lead you towards, uncovering something like this? Everyone remembers the famous story about how, as the 9/11 Commission ultimately confirmed, the NSA had, in fact, under existing surveillance guidelines, intercepted communications from some of the 9/11 hijackers, but didn't translate them until September 12th. So, as you mentioned earlier,
it's the old get smart line.
Yeah.
Missed it by that much.
Right. And now you've got a question of, if you have, vastly more information in, how do you get someone properly sorting through, and, presumably a lot of the stuff won't be in English, translating to the point where you have anything to do with tactical information that you could use to really prevent something from happening.
On a larger scale, I'm also interested in, and this is, I suppose, slightly tangential, but the FISA court ruling from last spring, which supposedly sparked this by the way the ruling has been characterized is that the FISA court apparently abruptly decided that while it's always traditionally been the case that strictly foreign-to-foreign intercepts are not governed by U.S. law, either by FISA or the Fourth Amendment, that when these communications came through or were routed through U.S. switches, suddenly all the protections due domestic communications applied. That struck me as a little unusual, not completely unbelievable, but I find it interesting that apparently the FISA court is now entertaining an ACLU request for the substance of that ruling. This is, as they themselves note, somewhat unprecedented. I'm curious as to whether something about the way this ruling has been characterized may be off, and whether that might not explain why the FISA court seems, again, in a very unusual move, willing to entertain the disclosure of the substance of that ruling.
Well, let's just back up and talk about what's actually going on with this ACLU case.
Yeah.
This was something that the ACLU disclosed on Friday. On August 8th, the ACLU filed a motion with the FISA court to disclose relevant rulings to the debate over the revision of FISA and surveillance law more generally. It cited the sunsetting of the Protect America Act in 6 months as being, in the public interest, compelling the disclosure of these rulings to the extent that, you can just black out the relevant parts that, specify sources and methods. One of the two rulings in particular that they said they wanted from the FISA court was the January 10th, 2007 ruling that Alberto Gonzalez cited as innovative enough to justify putting the warrantless surveillance program under FISA now. No one really knows, or at least not to my knowledge, what in fact that ruling had anything to do with, and what the FISA court could have decided that would have allowed something like anything envisioned under the terrorist surveillance program to fall under FISA, given what Reisman and Whitblow have reported about that program. It strains credulity that there could have been an innovative enough ruling on January 10th to allow the program to come back to the FISA court, that in only 2 months would then have been somehow annulled or otherwise frustrated the administration so completely over something that, as you say, seems a rather basic point of surveillance law that would justify the seemingly wholesale revision FISA. And so the ACLU wanted, in particular, those two documents. On Friday, the FISA court told the ACLU that it was requesting the government submit an argument to the court specifying why national security compelled keeping those cases secret. Why disclosure would harm national security. That's not the same as saying that ultimately they'll disclose it. I think they have to do it by, I think the government has to submit its brief by the 31st, and then after that, the ACLU will have till something like September 14th to submit a counter-argument. But it really does show that the FISA court is taking seriously the idea that, we're in a period like the one in between the Church and Pike commissions and the creation of FISA, where the rules of the road, legally speaking, on surveillance are completely in flux, and that creates a compelling public interest that wouldn't have existed probably before 9/11 to disclose opinions of this super secret court. And so now it looks like there's at least some willingness on the part of the court to allow us some kind of peek in to what in fact goes on within these programs and how the FISA court interprets what it's given. The FISA Court of Appeals has only sat once. It's just a black box of law.
Right. No, given all, so I suppose this could throw sort of a wrench into the works, but I think unless some sort of serious chicanery is revealed here, it strikes me that the situation the Democrats now find themselves in, even if, as you suggest, they were responding to a sort of short-term tactical threat or warning, is that the Republicans seem to have learned from Reagan's old dictum that the closest thing on earth to immortality is a government program. And it seems as though once they get back, sunset notwithstanding, they're going to now be in the position, either if they revise this or prepared to allow it to expire, no longer to be in the position of licensing a dramatic new expansion of surveillance powers, but of somehow wanting to limit existing surveillance powers. And there's always sort of a status quo bias with these things.
Yeah.
If you want to dramatically expand surveillance powers, we want scrutiny. If these powers are in place, well, why do you want to impose new limits on intelligence agencies? And so I'm wondering how realistic do you find it? You're actually talking to some of the staffers involved. How plausible do you find these claims that this is going to get sort of top of the inbox attention when they're back in session?
Well, the Democrats are being inundated with really freaked out liberal complaints. This is probably appropriate. The ACLU has sent something like several thousand. I forget in fact what in fact the number is, but the ACLU basically bombarded the Democratic leadership over this and publicized it very, very well within hours of its passage, and it's been treated rather understandably as a major blunder on the left, which is furious at Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid for signing off on this, which is why Pelosi said, I'm going to revisit this as soon as we come back in session. Experience teaches, as you point out, Julian, that when these sorts of powers are created, they're incredibly hard to get rid of. Most of the Patriot Act sunsetting didn't actually stop the controversial provisions from going forward. And admittedly, that was under a Republican Congress as well as a Republican administration. But it strikes me as a rather plausible scenario from the way this debate went down, that McConnell and Gonzalez can just go back and in camera say, we've gotten so much intelligence based on this that has helped us save American lives. And they can probably pull out certain cases that they'll publicize with the actual relevance to the Protect America Act kept firmly in the background here. To say that we've saved American lives based on this revision, it would be a massive step back. We would go back into a kind of technological intelligence collection dark age. were we to get rid of these powers. And furthermore, we also need retroactive liability for telecom companies who helped us between 2001 and 2007. The play the administration has run for the past 7 years and has been very successful at it in periods of strength and in periods of weakness is basically to make a claim for audacity, that when they appear in a position of weakness, they make an even more stark claim about the heightened danger that they need to avert by accumulating power here. Most people thought after, to give the most obvious example, the 2006 elections, that there might be some movement towards restraining the Iraq War. Instead, we have the highest number of troops there that we've had since the invasion. It's not implausible that in the middle of a presidential primary season, the administration just make a very forceful play for keeping the surveillance powers it has, perhaps even expanding them more, and seeing how, once again, the Democratic Congress wants to flirt in an election year with being tarred with being soft on terrorism. It's a play that's worked for them every single time, and it's hard to imagine them suddenly, having Charlie Brown, find a way to kick the football when Lucy holds it and takes it away from him. So I wouldn't hold out much expectation that it can succeed unless you really see a rather forthright effort among the Democratic leadership to take forthrightly the argument that opposing this bill doesn't mean that we're all going to be blown up, which is a harder argument to make than someone saying, unless we have the surveillance authority in place, you and your children are all going to die.
Since you mentioned retroactive liability exemptions, maybe that's not a bad springboard to say something about the interesting hearings we had last week in the Ninth Circuit in a couple of amalgamated cases involving AT&T. And just it's actually a couple of suits. There's the Electronic Frontier Foundation's class action suit on behalf of AT&T customers, based on the disclosure by a former AT&T tech that there is a secret room somewhere in their San Francisco switching office.
611 Folsom Street, San Francisco. Right,
where. Well, are we sure that's not secret? It seems like everything else is. With the secret room where essentially a bay of NSA computers are getting, vast amounts of telecom data routed through them, and then another on behalf of a Islamic charity, which at least was temporarily given secret telephone logs suggesting that they had actually been surveilled
by a mistake. I understand.
Yeah. And there's an absolutely weird tango happening here where the documents proving that they had been surveilled, though they saw them, were then reclaimed by the government, which is now saying they don't have standing because they can't prove that they've been surveilled except from remembering seeing this document, which, by the way, is secret and so can't be shown again to the court to prove, I guess, that their recollections are accurate and they really do have standing.
Now, standing is very important here because there was recently a case in the Sixth Circuit last month in which I think it was last year on a district court judge named Anna Taylor ruled that an ACLU brought class action suit against the NSA could in fact go forward, that the plaintiffs there, a mixture of journalists and civil libertarians, believed that they had reason to suspect that they had been targets of the surveillance. And last month, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed Judge Taylor's argument, saying that because no one in the case, no one represented by the ACLU could actually document that the surveillance occurred, that surveillance on them occurred, there was just no basis for the lawsuit. And of course, under the terms of the law, you cannot actually know you are surveilled upon, and it's the same thing. Anyway, so for this case in San Francisco, the Ninth Circuit, or this three-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit, which is known as probably the most liberal appellate court, just beat up on the government's argument that the state secrecy doctrine compels that the entire case be thrown out of court. And I don't, in fact, know when we should be getting a ruling on this, but the government has vowed if it loses here to appeal, and it's interesting to see that there is some kind of judicial pushback to the idea that we actually have a credible account from this AT&T technician about how the program may work, and how telecom companies gave out a ton of subscriber information without having recourse to a court demand for it. And as a result, the Bush administration had said in the initial drafts of what becomes the Protect America Act, there needed to be retroactive liability for anyone who, Bush had a really convoluted and strange phrase the day that the bill passed, in which he said that anyone alleged to have helped the government in this program needed to have some kind of legal protection from anyone who might have been a Verizon customer or an AT&T customer who had reason to believe that their information was turned over to the NSA. In the technician's account, there are hubs across the West Coast that have served as basically switching stations for using technology that I won't pretend to understand, taking subscriber information and communications data and basically just routing them to NSA.
It does interestingly broach the question that if they just sell your information to telemarketers, mm-hmm. but then allege that they can they get out of that? Do they get an exemption by dint of their own allegation? I mean,
they do not call this to work like that. If you're
right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the serious problem here, of course, is that if you consider this in tandem with the removal of FISA really from any kind of substantial prospective review capacity. You have the courts taken out of the picture in advance in terms of having to come to them with some kind of evidentiary basis for beginning the investigation.
Right. You only have
and
to
then
have a
after the fact, you can't know if you've been surveilled. It's secret who's surveilled, so you can't have standing to challenge the program unless you can show what is legally a secret. And even if you could, the substance of what they're doing is supposed to be a state secret. So in different ways, it seems as though judicial scrutiny is being removed from every step. And it seems as though there's got to be just formally a problem here, where even if what they're doing is absolutely kosher, the idea that we have a national security situation where this kind of permanent emergency without end that allows them to sort of unilaterally assert that their own immunity from legal scrutiny creates a sort of novel constitutional situation where these programs essentially have to be asserted to be legal, and then their word has to be taken for it. Which I think prompted one of the Ninth Circuit judges to suggest that he felt like he was, or she was in Alice in Wonderland.
A related comment, from that hearing last week was that the deputy solicitor general made the point of saying, again and again, there are remedies in the event that the public feels that the government has gone too far, and they just simply weren't judicial ones. And that prompted one of the judges on the panel to say, well, then what are we really talking about? Impeachment? Which was, a funny applause line for, people like me who find themselves, sort of straining to understand what, in fact, any kind of political remedy for what the Bush administration is sort of embedded into the architecture of national security law could possibly comprise. Ultimately, it does look like, at this point, from the administration's perspective, they're moving back to a kind of earlier discredited line that Alberto Gonzalez put out at the beginning of the National Security Agency's warrantless wiretapping program in Baroglio, which is that simply, the power of the president to engage in enemy surveillance during wartime is simply plenary to his constitutional power. For a while, Gonzalez put out, in testimony before the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, this weird line in which he said, sure, this power is plenary, but we don't even really have to go there in terms of debating that, because the authorization to invade Afghanistan, serves as an adequate legal justification for this program. But just sort of in his back pocket was the argument that, all other things being equal, the president's the president, a war is a war, we can do whatever we feel like, and the Constitution has always already said that, which is just really not someone who, really not an argument that, unless you were at one point employed by the Bush administration, you would ever dream of making.
This is yet another sort of get smart tactic. The Congress approved this under their Article 1 powers.
Right.
Wait, they didn't. Would you believe Article 2? This weird sort of, Russian doll structure of nested arguments that are I think on face mutually inconsistent.
If I could read Arabic, the enterprise reporting I'd like to do is just find out if there's been a case, in a country like Egypt, where Hosni Mubarak has justified the sort of surveillance enterprises that, in perhaps a lower tech setting, we're talking about here simply by, citing the fact that the emergency law that establishes his office makes these powers plenary, and there's nothing that anyone can do. Yeah, sorry.
Robert Mugabe has already invoked...
right, yeah, that happened, didn't it?
Zimbabwe now has a far-reaching new surveillance law that was, I think, justified by reference to ours, which I think is maybe an underemphasized point, which is that, when we do shady things like this, it does remove a lot of the ability to sort of point to really sort of genuinely repressive regimes.
Right.
And,
which is cynical. I mean, let's not,
Oh, sure.
Mugabe would have done this anyway, but, it obviously does, paint the United States in an embarrassing light, and, distracts from, the actual issue that was occurring. There was, after Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, the Sudanese made some kind of play in the Security Council in which they said, by what right does, the United States, a nation that, that torturers have, to, criticize our genocide? As, disgusting an argument as that is, you had a whole bunch of people in the UN General Assembly sort of, scratching their beards and saying,
Well, again, this is another topic where I know we could go on for a while, but we're pushing up on an hour, so maybe we should just say a few things in our Panopticon edition of Blogging Heads TV about the recent revelations by the Wall Street Journal that back in May, I believe, DNI McConnell also authorized the use, which I think will begin in the fall, by a number of domestic groups of American spy satellites pointed at the United States. And, of course, these images have already been used in a limited capacity by various agents for essentially cartographic purposes. But now they will be available for more broad usage by, among other things, domestic law enforcement, which is raising hackles in a variety of ways. And so maybe you can offer your take on that, or?
Well, I just I noted first one of the things that people within the Pentagon bureaucracy, when the question of expanded homeland defense powers was breached, have worried about is an obscure law called the Posse Comitatus Act, which basically says that you can, as a result of the lingering bad taste of Reconstruction, the law passed in the 1870s, that the military cannot be used for law enforcement purposes. And throughout the last couple of years, that question has sort of informed a lot of what the Pentagon has sort of stopped itself from doing. The establishment of, for the first time, a military command with authority over the battle space of the Northern Hemisphere called Northern Command raised a lot of fears about that. Similarly, questions about when the president couldn't exercise his authority to federalize National Guard units which are under state command, raised a lot of questions about it. This is something that's, I know, debated sort of furiously in the office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense, and there's sort of a question of flux that just remains. No one is willing to say that we should in fact use the military for law enforcement measures, but sort of soft law enforcement measures, like in this case, what we're talking about with the use of spy satellites, given to the information from these satellites given to the Department of Homeland Security, and from there to the FBI, and then to state and local law enforcement, puts us really right up against the edge of posse comitatus, and it sort of raises the question then of to what degree should this law be revisited if we think that the use of these satellites for domestic law enforcement purposes is appropriate, or to what degree the balance that we've previously struck really is right. And I saw you had a very interesting and very good post about what current Fourth Amendment law means for this. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the Fourth Amendment is interesting here because of the ways that essentially it's rooted in a very different technological era. And so, indeed, initially you had, for Fourth Amendment purposes, the idea of a search defined along lines that essentially paralleled common law trespass. Mm-hmm. And so there was no real very complicated question about when a search had occurred. There might be a question about whether it was reasonable or not. But, a search was when someone came onto your property, rifled through your things, looked around your stuff, did things that would have constituted trespass if a private citizen had done them. It was not a search if someone walking by your house looked through your window and saw that you were beating your spouse or growing marijuana plants or something like that, because that was in plain view. Mm-hmm. And then in the early 20th century, technology sort of threw a monkey wrench into that. There was a case called Olmsted in the 1920s involving a wiretap. It was the first Supreme Court wiretap case. And the reasoning there was, well, they didn't cross the suspect's property. They had a tap on a line, down the street, and so this was not a search at all. And it was, it was not until the 60s in a case called U.S. v. Katz that the Supreme Court sort of changed course and said, no, look, the Fourth Amendment protects people and not places, and so what was definitive here has to be a reasonable expectation of privacy. And not any kind of particular property line being determined, because there is increasingly these varied technological ways to gain all the information you would through a traditional search without physically impinging on someone's property. Mm-hmm. Now, nevertheless, other kinds of technological observation that were still seen as analogous to ordinary visual observation at a distance were not regarded as searches. So, for example, when drug police would do an aerial flyover, and they would see, drug crops growing in someone's field behind their barn that you could never see if you're driving by their house sort of on the ground, but you could observe overhead. And so the court ruled that those were assimilated to this plain view doctrine. Mm-hmm. These were ordinary visual observation searches. There's a different line of cases, most recently a 2001 case called Kylo, that involved the use of infrared imaging technology to detect the grow lights that a marijuana farmer had in his garage. And so the heat from these lamps was detectable from across the street. And there, actually, and then Scalia wrote a decision saying, look, and it may be that all that was revealed here was the presence of these heat lamps, but still there's this kind of sort of bright line around the home. Maybe the bright line created by the infrared emanations mm-hmm. of your marijuana growing lights, but that you could not, by technological means, obtain information, at least from within the four walls of a private residence, that without that technology would require your physical searching. And so it's sort of an open question here. This would seem to suggest, for example, that if the satellite is using infrared imaging, that might have some sort of Fourth Amendment protection. Whereas if it's just doing kind of video observation, that would be in a different category. More interesting to me, though, is the way that things that are not considered searches, when we think about them in the context of observation by discrete humans with fallible memories, may be changed in its character when it's possible to record many images over long periods of time and subject them to powerful computerized analysis. Is something that was ordinary casual observation a search when you bring a certain kind of analytic power to bear on it? And that may seem implausible on face, but consider something like genetic privacy, where, it was never, I think, a question traditionally whether I had a privacy right if I left a strand of hair on a park bench. Well, if I left the hair behind, it was gone, and this was not something I had a privacy interest in. Now that it's possible, essentially through not a greater ability to acquire that piece of my body, but their greater ability to analyze it, someone might learn an enormous amount about my heredity, about any congenital conditions I might have, essentially a full kind of genetic map of my person. Your sense of the privacy implications of permitting that kind of analysis shifts. So there's this question again. I think not just of how the observation happens, but what kind of analysis it's possible to subject it to that implicates privacy in a new way. But it's really not clear that the court has the resources in precedent to deal with this intelligently. I think this is one of these places where, in a lot of ways, the Fourth Amendment has, as technology has improved, required Congress to really be the one to step up to the plate, because it changes much more quickly than this sort of slow system of accretion of precedent is able to deal with in a very functional way.
The question of whether analysis of the information changes its Fourth Amendment applicability is going to be an incredibly important one, because the analytic community inside U.S. intelligence is changing very rapidly. There's an increasing call for outside contractors to get involved in intelligence analysis. So there's going to be vastly more eyes competing for the same amount of collected information, and particularly now that we hear that the satellite imagery of whatever genesis might be going not just within U.S. intelligence, but within the law enforcement community down to whatever level of filtration, would seem to augur that some level of renewed court attention to this question is more or less demanded by this secret and at first blush innocuous decision, or more or less rapidly reached decision by McConnell. And in the Wall Street Journal article that broke this story, Charlie Allen, who's the head of intelligence for the Department of Homeland Security and is sort of a legendary longtime CIA figure, just said, rather candidly, I have no idea what the rules of the road for privacy and civil liberties interests are here. This is something that's completely new, and we're just going to take time in figuring out how, when we receive this information, we can responsibly dispense it to any law enforcement agency. An interesting admission that what McConnell has done is something so drastic in its implications that responsible officials inside the U.S. intelligence, defense, and law enforcement apparatuses just simply don't really know how to catch up with.
Yeah, and I think this is a point that you broached earlier in the conversation, but is worth mentioning now is the way powers justified for sort of anti-terrorism purposes end up being repurposed. I recall a couple of years back, I wrote a sort of squib about this, but there was something the Justice Department put out. It was called their field report on the Patriot Act. It was supposed to show how incredibly important the Patriot Act had been, and how important it was to renew it, because it had provided all these successes in fighting terrorism, supposedly. But if you went into it, you saw a lot of stuff like cracking gambling rings.
Right. There was some child pornography
arresting,
in there as well. I think.
Child pornographers, ecstasy smuggling rings. I recall there was one case that they tried to brand cyber terrorism that involved some hacker who is threatening to shut down life support systems at some kind of Arctic research. Totally unclear, and in fact quite dubious that this was a threat he could have conceivably ever carried out. But you see a lot of this. There was I've forgotten the name of it now. But there's I think an office out of the Navy, oddly enough, that used to be a sort of in charge of sort of narco trafficking. Technology transfer. They basically fund various kinds of high-tech responses to narco trafficking, and it was renamed as the Counter-Narco Terrorism Office shortly after 9/11. And so there's this attempt to fold as many things as possible under the aegis of terrorism. And part of the problem here is that the courts have always been very reluctant to make the kinds of common sense distinctions that you and I would make. We might say something like, look, we understand that there might be measures that we're okay with the government taking in terms of invasion of privacy if the idea here is that what we're going to do is stop a terrorist dirty bomb from blowing up in Manhattan, but that perhaps we're not that comfortable with them using in order to pursue kind of routine drug dealing cases, say. But the courts have never been that eager to kind of take that legislative role and say, well, we're going to make distinctions on what kind of searches are reasonable on the basis of what the level of disaster they're trying to avert is. Is it someone buying a joint, or is it a dirty bomb? Which I guess becomes a problem again when these are sold in that context.
And Congress is reluctant to intervene until it sees some kind of crisis point develop in a court, so it can become a bit of a vicious circle. So I guess that's a good place to just ask a kind of final question here, which is just Julian, do you feel safe yet? Now that the Protect America Act is in place.
I feel safer all the time. When the satellite images of me padding around my home nude are on YouTube, I'll feel safer still.
Put them up there yourself, man. I've been I just furiously hit refresh, but I'm just not seeing these things pop up.
Yeah, I think at the end I would be unwilling to do this. Not so much because of any kind of personal modesty, which I have very little, but because perhaps much like what would happen if I looked through the NSA's dossiers concerning me, is that really the fear here is that no one actually wants to watch.
Well, I mean,
maybe,
yeah.
So maybe not. But
just if ever there's been a time I'd want to be an NSA technician, or an NSA line analyst. I just love to see some of the stuff that I'm now allowed to collect. Show up on YouTube. Someone wrote that script that allows you to see who's editing Wikipedia, and they found over the last couple days that CIA's been engaged in seemingly innocuous scrubs of Wikipedia on things that are related to its core competency. Like there was some piece about Bill Casey that someone at CIA was or someone at a CIA IP address had corrected. I'd love to now see who's uploading stuff on YouTube that comes out of Fort Meade.
Well, ever since I saw the lives of others, I'm taking a kind of comfort. I almost get a kind of warmth in the cockles of my heart, thinking that there is some sort of sympathetic, sort of Stasi-style fellow with big raver headphones on, sitting in a garret somewhere, listening perhaps even to our conversation even now, and poring over his Goethe in the lacuna in our chat.
Well, I guess we'll have to wait to really not just feel safe, but feel entertained as well.
Well, Spencer, to you and to the folks at Blogging Heads, and to our anyone else who may be listening either now or in the future, we bid a fond farewell.